Far from his usual world, surrounded by the studio and cameras, Clint Eastwood felt slightly uncomfortable. His vast experience on film sets didn't help him in this context. He sat on the red couch in front of the camera, a bit nervous, though trying to stay calm. The Steve Harvey show always attracted attention, but today the atmosphere was especially tense. Steve, known for his humor and charisma, now looked much more serious than usual. He sat directly across from Clint, and between them was only a few meters, yet the distance between their worlds seemed endless. The studio was filled with dozens of cameras, production teams, and producers, but at that moment, everything felt like a fog. Nothing seemed as important as what was about to happen. "Clint, tell us, how did you start working in movies?" Steve asked. His voice sounded familiar, but for some reason, today this question carried an overwhelming weight. Clint paused for a few seconds, but then he remembered how every moment of his career had to be emotionally charged and real. Perhaps he started answering with a slightly different tone than usual. He rarely showed his emotional side in public, but today was the moment when everything could change. "I worked hard," he began. "But I always tried to find the strength to be honest, even when it felt like everything might fall apart. I always believed that a man's true strength is his ability to show himself as he truly is, without embellishments. And that's what became the foundation of my success." The audience began to clap softly, but at that moment, just as Clint finished his answer, the camera suddenly stopped. Everyone in the studio sensed that something was wrong. Steve Harvey, known for his carefree nature, looked slightly confused. And then something happened that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. Steve made an unexpected gesture. He closed his eyes, took off his glasses, and quietly, barely audibly, said, "Clint, I respect you, but where were you when I really needed help?" And that question became a true shock for everyone. Clint went silent. His face became as immovable as a rock. Everyone in the audience, even a few producers, flinched from the awkwardness of the moment. This wasn't just another TV gimmick or a question for the show. Steve was sincere, and everyone could feel it. Clint looked at him, and his eyes seemed to come alive again. "I don't understand, Steve. What do you mean?" he asked, though he sensed that this question could change everything. Steve kept himself composed, but there was instability in his voice. "I remembered how we were together on set. We were alone, as usual, but then you left me. I was on the edge. I waited for you, but you left. What does that mean?" These words hung in the air, and everyone in the studio felt the atmosphere shift dramatically. Everyone awaited Clint's reaction, but what he would do was a complete mystery. Clint slowly placed his hand on the armrest of the couch, his heart beating faster than usual, but he gathered himself again. "I didn't know how you felt then," he replied quietly. "I did what I thought was right. But that doesn't justify my absence." And then, tears began to appear in Steve Harvey's eyes. Emotion. The audience fell silent as Steve looked into the camera, then turned his gaze back to Clint. "I only understood it now," he whispered. "I've spent my life trying to be strong, but sometimes that strength is just a mask." Clint Eastwood felt his heart tighten, but he didn't know what to say. It was a moment that left him speechless. Instead of defending himself again, he accepted the fact that you can't always be the hero. And so, from the start of this conversation, an unexpected tension arose in the studio. Now, when Steve allowed himself to show vulnerability, it felt not just like a moment of weakness, but a confirmation of how important it is to be human. Clint watched him silently, but his eyes softened. This was no longer just a situation on a show. This was an important realization that they were both experiencing together. Would they be able to find common ground? Or would this be just the beginning of something much bigger? The show was in full swing. The studio was filled with bright lights and the sound of applause as Steve Harvey appeared on stage. His distinctive laughter echoed with every step, and he began his show by engaging the audience, who were eagerly awaiting a string of famous guests and emotional moments. The camera captured everything as one of Hollywood's most respected actors, Clint Eastwood, emerged from behind the curtains. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The audience jumped to their feet, and the hall filled with a buzz of excitement. Clint embodied the look, character, and sensitivity typically attributed to the heroes of his films. But today, he was not just an actor. Today, he became part of a much deeper, more intimate story. Steve Harvey, who was ready to play his usual role as the humorous host, unexpectedly felt a heavy moment. He had met with big names before, spoken with the best, but now sitting before him was a man whose words carried weight that even Steve couldn't predict. Clint sat opposite him, and an electric tension hung in the air. At that moment, everything seemed on the verge of a great emotional storm. Steve began first, surprised and unsure of how to start the conversation. "Well, Clint, it's not often you meet guests like you. You know, we're always trying to break stereotypes, but your story, it's real. How did you get here? I mean, in a very literal sense." Clint paused, looking at Steve with a heavy, but deep gaze. He seemed quiet, like those moments when a hero chooses not to act but to reflect, creating an almost sacred atmosphere in the room. "You know, Steve, when I first started down this path, it was never easy for me to talk about how I felt. But the moment I heard you speak about changing perspectives, how a real man can impact those around him, it really touched me." Steve, bewildered, leaned forward involuntarily. "You're not joking, Clint? Is this about me?" And then, everything changed. Clint shared a story no one could have expected. He spoke about a time when he met someone on the street who became a bright example of how, even in the darkest times, even in the worst circumstances, one must remain human. He spoke about how this person taught him the importance of not responding to aggression with aggression, but learning to listen, truly listen. It was a moment of truth. "And so, Steve," Clint continued, "I realize that even if you think all your efforts aren't paying off, you are still changing the world. Little by little. And one thing you said completely changed my outlook on life. You said that even the smallest step could be the start of something big." Steve was stunned. He had never witnessed such an emotional shift on his show. Everyone in the studio felt the importance of this moment, and the audience began asking each other whether it's possible to change the world, or if one word really can make such a change. "Clint, this is incredible," Steve said quietly, as emotions started surfacing. "You're real. And you know what? I've also realized something important. Even if it seems like a small step, it can change someone's life forever." And then, something no one expected happened. Instead of making another witty remark, Steve calmly leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and said softly, "You know, Clint, I'm a bit emotional right now. I don't often talk about moments like this on the show, but your words touched me. They awakened something in me that I haven't felt in a long time." The studio fell silent. Even the audience didn't expect this turn of events. Steve Harvey, known for his energy and humor, had now become part of a profound conversation where the absence of aggression and mutual understanding became the central themes. This wasn't just a show, it was a moment when people began to realize that change could happen in the smallest steps, and even the most famous people aren't immune to their own emotions. But the story didn't end there. Steve, letting out a soft sigh, began his second question. "I want you to tell the audience. What do you want them to remember after today's show?" Clint paused, taking a deep breath. "I want them to understand, don't be afraid to be real. If you want to change the world, start with yourself. Don't respond to aggression with aggression. And remember, even a small step can change everything." Moments of silence filled the room as people began to grasp the significance of these words. The studio was silent, and every viewer seemed to feel part of this intimate conversation. Clint Eastwood, a true master of his craft, continued to speak in his calm, confident voice. His words resonated deeply. "You know, Steve, I've often thought that by the end of my career, it would all be about the big films, the fame. But the older you get, the more you realize that the most important thing in life is the moments you share with others. Sometimes, even the smallest gesture of kindness can change the course of events." Steve moved a little closer to Clint, his expression becoming more serious. He could tell that these words truly mattered and understood that now was the moment to be especially attentive. That's something many of us forget, isn't it? How we forget how important it is to be there for each other. It's so simple. Clint nodded slightly and continued. Yes, Steve. I remember one moment from my early work. I was filming a scene in a movie, and one particular scene was emotionally difficult. I couldn't hold back the tears, because even though it was just acting, I felt that those emotions were real. And when the shooting ended, the director came up to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "You gave them a part of yourself." That's when I realized that the real strength in our lives isn't in what we can get from the world, but in what we can give. These words hung in the air. The studio was filled with a silence that could be felt. Everyone in the room, from the youngest to the oldest, listened closely, trying to comprehend the depth of it. I remember another time, Steve, Clint continued. I was in a small town in the eastern U.S., somewhere in the mountains, where everyone knew each other. I met a man who worked on a farm, a simple, humble guy. He told me about how he struggles with life's hardships every day. And in that moment, standing before him, I realized that all the problems we face in big cities aren't really the most important things. People truly value each other and just want to see goodness. Steve couldn't help but agree. You know, Clint, I always thought that success in life was about money, recognition, and fame. But now, after everything we've discussed, I'm starting to realize that it's not like that at all. And then, almost spontaneously, Clint added, I think every one of us has a chance to change something in this world. Sometimes it's just a choice, to be kind to the person next to you. And even if it seems small, for someone, it could be the most important moment of their life. These words felt like something people who had lived through a lot in life could truly understand. For older people, who remember times when help was more valuable than material goods, this was a moment when they could feel part of something meaningful. And even if they no longer believed in the big world, big fame, or big money, they still believed in kindness and the importance of simple, everyday gestures. The room remained silent for a few more seconds, and even the camera stood still. Everyone was captivated by the moment, realizing that this was not just an interview, but a real moment for reflection. After a pause, Steve, rising to his feet, said, "Thank you, Clint. These aren't just words, this is real learning. And I'm sure that today you've changed the minds of many people in this room. And even for those watching us at home, your words will echo for a long time." And at that moment, when the camera panned back to the audience, the viewers began to applaud. They were all grateful to have witnessed not just a show, but a truly deep conversation that had genuinely touched their hearts. It was a story that could have happened to anyone, and everyone in the room felt its reality, because it wasn't just a tale, it was a moment of truth. The studio remained in tense silence as Clint Eastwood addressed Stephen. His voice was calm, but there was a depth in it that made every listener feel like a special part of this conversation. I remember one instance, Steve, Clint began, his gaze fixed on the camera. It happened in my youth, when I was just starting my journey in film. I went to shoot a film in a small town in the Midwest, such a cozy place. The people there didn't have much, but they were always ready to share the last piece of bread. I was on set for a movie, and during a break, I had the chance to talk with the locals. I remember how one woman, about 60 years old, approached me after shooting. She asked, "Can you help my son, he really wants to work in film?" I told her I could only help if he truly wanted it himself. Steve smiled, feeling how important it was to hear that. "And what happened next?" he asked, giving Clint the opportunity to continue. "That son," Clint continued, "was a very humble guy. He didn't have a college degree, he didn't have money to travel to Los Angeles, but he was ready to work harder than anyone else. I told him, if you want this, I'll help, but only if you're true and honest with yourself." It wasn't just a career opportunity, it was a chance for him to change his life. The room caught this moment and grew even quieter. It was a real story, with real people who weren't dreaming of big money or fame. They simply wanted to change their fate. It was a moment when people over 55 could recall times in their own lives when they were given a chance, or when they themselves took responsibility for their decisions. This guy became a very successful actor, Clint continued, but not because of money or great opportunities. He understood that what really matters isn't what you have, but what you're willing to do for others. The room applauded. For the older audience members who had lived through hardships, this moment was a real reminder that, despite the years, there is something more important than material things, real relationships. Supporting each other, and the ability to change the lives of people around you. True change, Steve, Clint concluded, doesn't happen through large financial investments or bright opportunities. It happens through small acts of kindness and support. It's something you can't buy with any amount of money. It's something we all have inside of us. That's just wonderful, Steve replied, slightly pulling a smile. That's real success, supporting each other. The room fell into deep reflection. The studio was not just a filming location. It was a place where people, having lived through the years, had realized that success isn't measured by how much money you've made or what fame you've gained, but by how much you've given to others. And when Clint Eastwood wrapped up his words, it felt like a personal message for every viewer watching the show at home. It doesn't matter how old you are, what matters is how you live today. Every day is a new chance to change a life. Sometimes that chance comes through simple but important decisions, like supporting each other. The room sat quietly, listening intently to every word, as Steve Harvey looked at Clint Eastwood, sensing that the conversation was taking on even greater depth. You know, Clint, Steve said, pausing slightly before starting a new thought. You just described something very important. Many people, especially those who have gone through hard times, often forget what really matters. They strive for great achievements but forget about the small things that can change their lives. Clint nodded. He knew what Steve meant. These weren't just words about support, but also about understanding that there are things more important than money and fame. He paused and looked into the camera, addressing the people who were probably sitting in front of their televisions across the country. I've met many people in my life, Clint said, who seemed to have absolutely nothing. They were from small towns, had very limited opportunities, but they were the best people I've ever met. Sometimes even one small step, something as simple as caring about the people around you, can change everything. It can change not just one life, but an entire community. Steve looked at him with interest. Can you tell us about one of those moments? What exactly struck you? Clint thought for a few seconds. I remember working on a film many years ago. We were shooting a scene in a small town in the south. This town was really forgotten. It seemed like the people here hardly ever left their houses because there were no jobs or prospects. But one woman, a local teacher, would approach everyone. She was a true role model for her students and for us as a team. What did she do? Steve asked, intrigued by this moment. This woman, Clint continued, didn't just teach children. She herself became an example for her students, even for the adults. Every day after school, she would come to the library and open the doors for anyone who wanted to learn. Many of these people didn't even have the basic skills to find a job, but this woman helped them learn, communicate, and develop themselves. And this wasn't just a job, this was her mission. The studio grew cozy and quiet again. People on the other side of the screen understood that this wasn't just a story about a teacher, it was a metaphor for all of us. And you know what happened? Clint added, leading to an important conclusion. A few years later, this small town became a true example for others. People from other places started moving there, and many young families began opening their own businesses. This teacher changed everything, not through money or power, but through the way she treated the people around her. Steve Harvey was amazed. That's incredible. And it proves that even one person can change an entire community, simply by showing care and support. Clint smiled. Sometimes it seems like change has to be big and noticeable, but in reality, it often starts with small actions. They may go unnoticed by others, but for someone, it will be a real turning point. Agreed, Steve replied, pointing to the camera as if addressing the viewers. This is a great reminder for all of us. Great success often starts with small, but meaningful steps. Yes, Clint added, and if each of us took just one such step every day, we would see changes we never even dreamed of. The room applauded in support of this idea. And this conversation on Steve Harvey's show certainly left a deep mark on the hearts of those listening, reminding them that each of us has the power to change the world for the better. Sometimes all that's needed is not to follow the script, but to act from the heart, supporting those around us. The room fell silent, and on stage, there was a sense that every word Clint Eastwood spoke left an important mark on the hearts of everyone present. Steve Harvey once again turned to the camera, looking at his guest with gratitude. I think we've all received a very important message today, Clint. And perhaps we should not forget that change can start from small things. Sometimes, the best investment isn't in money, but in people. Clint nodded, his gaze calm and thoughtful. That's true. We often search for big solutions to big problems, but sometimes the greatest changes happen in those moments when we simply support each other. If each of us starts with small things, offering support and help, the world can change for the better, and it will start right with us. Steve, realizing that the story was coming to its conclusion, looked at the audience and once again addressed them. Today, we've not only talked about great things, but also about the importance of how our actions, even the smallest ones, can impact others. And I hope that each of you will leave here today with the understanding that great changes begin with simple and sincere steps. The studio erupted in applause. People stood up, clapping with gratitude, understanding that this wasn't just a show, it was an important lesson that could be applied in everyday life. Clint looked at Steve, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction from being able to share his experiences and thoughts with everyone present. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Steve. I hope this conversation helps at least one person take the right step and change their life for the better. Steve smiled. Clint, it's been a great pleasure. And I think what you said will inspire people long after we leave this stage. And as the lights dimmed and the camera slowly pulled back, it was clear that this moment would stay in the memory of everyone who had been part of the show. After all, even in ordinary life, each of us has the power to change the world, starting with small and meaningful steps. And perhaps, that's the greatest thing we can do for others. The show ended, but Clint Eastwood's message remained in the hearts of people, reminding them that even the smallest actions can change the entire world.